I've made it no secret by now that I'm a huge fan of Metroid. My avatar still currently has a Metroid in it, and my username used to be Metroid Junkie, so you tell me. With that in mind, it's kind of weird how until now I've yet to review what's arguably the most significant game in the franchise's history. While Metroid Prime would go on to bring it into 3D and its trilogy is actually my personal favorite, there's another that made huge strides in the 2D space. I think it's about time to finally right that wrong and pursue Ridley yet again as I take on Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo in my super review. Let's get super started. In many ways, Super Metroid is the one that revolutionized the way Metroid is handled and almost completely withstands the test of time. While Metroid 2 added the ability to crouch, Super Metroid added diagonal aiming as well as overall much more fluid controls and perhaps most importantly, a map. It can be really easy to get lost wandering about Metroid's large worlds, and being able to see exactly where you are is far more significant than you may think. One unique thing that really no other Metroid game has that this one has is a sprint button. That's probably because the other 2D Metroid games since just seem to sprint by default, but one could argue it could be handy if platforming is on the precise side. You start out with no weapons save for your pea shooter, and unlike Prime or Fusion would later do, this makes no attempt to justify it. You're simply underpowered until you increase your arsenal. It's the bread and butter of Metroidvania, and I always love the satisfying feeling when you go from zero to hero, so to speak. We'll start out with items from previous games, as fittingly your first item you acquire is the Morph Ball. Not only is it your first item in the original NES game, but you even go down the worn, broken down path of Zebes from the original game to get to it too, making it past Mother Brain's original chamber. The Morph Ball is essentially Nintendo's answer to crawl spaces fitting into small nukes. Literally, they were going to make her crawl, but graphical limitations can make some wonderful things sometimes. Speaking of which, you soon after gain missiles. Unlike later 2D Metroid games, you press the switch to them rather than hold a button down. Naturally, they're your limited but powerful option for taking out stronger enemies, and along with health, drop from enemies to replenish. It's pretty much your go-to for harming bosses, as your little power beam isn't exactly going to cut it. The Morph Ball Bomb is the next item, both allowing you to blow up certain obstructions and potentially allowing you to break the game. While I'm not sure it was really intended to be used this way, you can propel yourself up with bomb explosions and you can lay down essentially an unlimited number of them. With the proper timing with it, I believe I can fly, and you can even sequence break in some cases to get to places sooner than you're supposed to. After that is the high jump boots. It's pretty self-explanatory. This one doesn't make you fly. To quote Samurai Jack, you just jump good. Well, at least the long beam didn't make a return since your power beam just has infinite range from the start. This next item actually originated in Metroid 2, interestingly enough, the Spacer Beam. It splits your beam into 3, but it doesn't split the damage, so basically it triples your firepower and makes it easier to hit enemies with. While it is an optional upgrade, and I think I actually missed it in my playthrough, it's definitely worth grabbing if you can. The next reoccurring item is the Various Suit, handy since Metroid is one of the few franchises to actually have heat convection. What convection is basically that the air around lava/magma is hot enough that you can be roasted alive if you aren't properly protected. The Various Suit handles this, but it won't protect you from direct contact with lava or magma. Next up is actually kind of the opposite of that, the Ice Beam. It freezes enemies right in their tracks. This can be both useful for stopping enemies, doing the missile follow-up, or just using as stepping stones, which is what the game obviously has in mind for you to progress with. One really handy thing though is that unlike Zero Mission and Fusion, unless mods or cheats are involved, Super Metroid allows you to disable beams at your leisure. You can't use them all at once, but you can shut off ice if you just want to damage enemies without freezing them. Next up is the Wave Beam, which basically makes a helix pattern and can go through walls. Obviously, it's really handy if you want to destroy an enemy that's behind a wall or just hit switches behind walls. It can stack with any other beam, so it's generally good to have on for that extra additional effect. Another Metroid 2 introduced item is the Space Jump. This is definitely my favorite item in 2D Metroids, or maybe Metroidvania in general, because it basically allows you to fly. Or rather, you can infinitely spin through the air, which is basically the same as flying when you really get down to it. While I did mention that the Morph Ball bombs can be used to gain flight, this is much easier to do and has the advantage of ease of horizontal travel. Next up is the Plasma Beam, which was also introduced in Metroid 2. It straight up cuts through enemies that are vulnerable to it, so it's very powerful. It can't stack with the Spacer though, and you get it pretty late game. Still, it's always satisfying to get the Plasma Beam in the 2D Metroids. It really felt like a turning point when I got it in Fusion, for instance. Last but not least of the OG Metroid items is the almighty Screw Attack. It's a funnily appropriate name because it's a great weapon for just saying screw you to just about anything in the room. Basically, it lets you rip through most enemies just by spinning into them. Obviously, combined with the space jump, this makes you a very terrifying force indeed, capable of flying around and ripping most common enemies to pieces. Its power is certainly befitting as the last real upgrade item you get. I believe it's time to talk about weapons and items that Super Metroid actually brought to the table. It starts out strong by introducing the Charge Beam. While it's not quite as glorious to get a hold of as Prime since it doesn't attract items to you, it's still handy if you want some extra firepower at no cost. Since you can use it with beam stacks, it becomes very potent with the plasma and wave beams. While holding a charge, it also acts as a pseudo screw attack, but only for the first hit. The next new weapon is one that'll really bring the roof down, or at least enemies hanging around on roofs. It is in fact a very powerful super missile. Using its own very limited ammo, it fires faster and hits a lot harder than regular missiles. Every impact causes the screen to shake, and it can dislodge enemies walking around on walls and ceilings. Obviously, you'll want to reserve it for bosses and other super tough enemies, and it has its own doors that require it too. Another new addition for Super is the almighty Speed Booster, allowing you to move at Super Sonic the Hedgehog speeds, busting through enemies and blocks meant for it. If you crouch while running, it also holds a charge that you can activate to do a continuous jump in one direction until you collide with something, also called a Shine Spark. I guess blast processing wasn't so necessary for those high speeds after all, eh, Sega as a first-party developer? What, too soon? The next newbie is an absolute blast, super limited in amount, but it will absolutely devastate everything around you. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, I am referring to the almighty Power Bomb, and it's basically the super missile of the Morph Ball Bomb. Who am I kidding? Even that isn't enough to describe it, it's more like a freaking nuke. You drop the thing, it explodes, anything around you that isn't top-tier enemies is getting vaporized on the spot. Obviously, it's super deadly and of course useful for destroying blocks and obstacles specifically for it. Next up is the Grapple Beam. While it would later see a return in the Prime Trilogy and Other M, it wouldn't really see a return to 2D-styled Metroid until Samus Returns over 23 years later. Basically, you just shoot at the right block and swing across places like in the other games, but it's not so simple controlling in Super. It really is better suited for Metroid Prime where you have 3D movement, at least in my opinion. It's not really terrible, but it can take some time getting used to, and the space jump obviously makes it obsolete the second you get it. Interestingly enough, this next one doesn't really appear anywhere else outside of Primes 1 and 3. I speak, of course, of the Humble X-Ray Scope. Essentially, it creates a cone of light that wherever you look around reveals hidden blocks and the like. Fusion and Zero Mission would basically have you power bomb everything to expose such blocks, and Metroid Samus Returns has a pulsating power called the Scan Pulse, but Super Metroid is the only 2D one to really have a proper visor item. I guess one could argue that, like with the Grapple Beam, it makes more sense in the Prime games. The next one up is the very useful Gravity Suit. Naturally, like any other entry in the series that has it, its primary function is to allow you to move normally through water instead of very slowly. That being said, the 2D games tended to have an extra benefit that the fully 3D Metroids didn't so much have, and Super Metroid is no exception. What I mean is that unlike with the Various Suit, you are now completely immune to lava, even by direct touch. Not just convection this time, you can literally swim through lava and not suffer any damage, which is really nifty. Don't get too excited though, there are still some hazards that can hurt you. The last of Super Metroid introduced items is weirdly enough the Humble Spring Ball. Unlike later games where it would just be introduced as soon as you got something like the high jump boots, it's acquired late game, which I think is kinda weird. By then it seems kinda pointless, it probably would have made some earlier sections easier if you got them with the Morph Ball Bombs or something like with the Prime Trilogy. That is it for all the new items, although technically you gain another thing, but it's only a circumstantial ability that isn't really a permanent addition, but I'll get more into that later. In addition, Super Metroid actually has a unique upgrade that's not found anywhere else in the series. It's probably because the devs figured it's cool, but it doesn't really have a practical purpose. I speak, of course, of the reserve tanks. While you can, like missiles, super missiles, and power bombs, find upgrades for the energy in the form of tanks, this is kinda special. Rather than going straight into your health, reserve tanks are secondary health. They either happen automatically as you run out, essentially serving the same purpose as fairies from Zelda, or you manually inject them into your health. Like I said, they were probably dropped from later games because they're pointless and just serve to burn time as you wait for your health to refill. Honestly, they don't really do anything that another energy tank wouldn't do better. It is pretty cool as a concept though. It's funny how Metroid Prime 3 would end up taking the idea of injecting an energy tank in reverse, sacrificing health for firepower. To that end, of course, you had plenty of enemies to test your weapons and various instruments of destruction on. At first glance, this game seems to be all about throwing you in the deep end because your very first battle is with freaking Ridley. Fret not, of course, the game doesn't expect you to actually win. If your health gets low enough, Ridley will simply leave on his own, triggering the new series' famous escape sequence. While Metroid 1 also had an escape sequence, this one is unique since it happens at the beginning of the game, something Metroid Prime would later do too. It is possible to damage Ridley enough to make him escape before your health runs too low, but all you really get is an animation of him almost dropping the Metroid tank and, of course, bragging rights. The first real enemies fittingly come after a return to the older part of Zebes, where space pirates suddenly start patrolling the area. The first boss is actually a concept that Metroid Fusion is the only other game that really has a Chozo statue that comes alive. Rather than actually being a parasite though, the statue crumbles away and reveals a creature called a Chorizo. It walks towards you, waves fire at you, and spits what I can only assume are eggs at you. Being the first real boss, it's obviously on the easy side, but don't you worry, the game will not remain this easy. The Spawn Spore is the next major boss fight and is probably one of the less memorable ones, to be honest. It very much encompasses a criticism of some bosses where it's just a wait until weak point is vulnerable boss. It flails around with spores popping in until it opens its big jaw and you pump it full of missiles. It's pretty weak stuff, although I'd say Metroid Fusion would definitely make the concept better with a Nettori fight. Thankfully, the next boss is so much more interesting, Kraid. He's about the same size as he was in the original Metroid, so he doesn't pose much of a threat, but at least it was nice to see him make a cameo appearance. Just kidding, that's actually Kraid's spawn, and you can tell they placed him there as a fake-out since he's about the same size as he was in the NES original. Oh no, the actual Kraid is now essentially full-on Godzilla-sized. He's so large that you have to do some platforming just to reach his monstrous mug. The disturbing implications aside, it feels pretty good to bring him down. He's also the first of 4 you need to get through to get into Mother Brain's lair, doubled from the original 2. And this is the part of the review where I do a PSA, Nintendo, please bring Kraid back. Ever since he was cut from Metroid Prime, he hasn't appeared anywhere else except Zero Mission, and that's a remake. I think it's time for him to finally come out of retirement since you love putting Ridley freaking everywhere. You can even put Kraid and Ridley together a la Smough and Ornstein from Dark Souls. All I'm saying is Kraid can use some love since he was there from the beginning. Even Mother Brain sort of got a cameo in Prime 3 in the form of the corrupted Aurora unit. The next boss is rather unique for the Metroid series for more reasons than one, Crocomire. This boss is completely indestructible in any and all of your attacks. You don't get some super special damaging move either, all you can do is fire missiles and super missiles into his mouth a la Kraid to make him back off. I guess it just doesn't agree with his stomach or something. Of course, if he found that irritating, he's really not going to like what happens next, because once you make him back up enough, the ground gives way beneath him. Melting into a skeleton in the lava, he actually has a fake out afterwards with his skeleton seemingly about to begin a phase 2. This isn't a fantasy game though, skeletons can't move without muscle, so he simply collapses to the ground. The next boss is a cameo from Luigi's Mansion. Obviously that's a joke, I'm just saying if you're paying attention. Seriously though, the next boss is Phantoon, a ghost that likes to disappear and reappear to pelt you with fire. He provided a pretty good challenge as a wake-up call boss, more than the other bosses you've faced up to this point. I'd also like to point out that he cameos in Other M, but Kraid remains without a home. Come on Nintendo, get on that. Okay, Kraid rants are over, I promise. Phantoon is another one of the major 4 from Mother Brain's lair. Botwoon is honestly very forgettable as a boss, even more so than Spore Spawn. It's a serpent-like boss zipping around from hole to hole and you have to fire at its head. This might be a controversial statement, I don't know, but Twin Mold on Majora's Mask is a much better use of the fire at a worm's head to kill it concept. I doubt many will say Botwoon is their favorite, at least not before this review, because there are some determined to be contrarians, but moving on. The next boss is the third of the big 4, Dragon. It sort of resembles a heavily mutated seahorse, notable in that there's actually a really quick way to stomp it flat. All you gotta do is preemptively destroy the turrets in the room with missiles to reduce them to their wires, and then purposely let it grab you. After that, you just use the grapple beam on the exposed wiring left behind on the turrets. While it causes Samus some level of damage, it absolutely devastates Dragon. Fried fish, anyone? As the little Dragon sing thy to thy rest, you've won. You better prepare yourself because this next boss fight is easily the hardest in the entire game, and I am not kidding. It's the Golden Chorizo fight, or at least it made the 2 subsequent bosses look like a joke in my opinion. The Chorizo's bigger and badder brother, this one's far more aggressive, dodges missiles and actually grabs your super missiles in midair to throw them back at you. Technically you can only grab one at a time, but it's still no joke to say the least. The charge beam is your best bet, but even then it gave me quite a lot of trouble with its wave attacks. Thankfully the screw attack you get from defeating this monster eases the sting a little bit. After that beast of a fight, the rematch with Ridley almost felt oddly easy in comparison. That's not to say it was effortless, and maybe the point is that you're now strong enough to take him on. It sort of reminds me of the SAX from Metroid Fusion, but that's not to say he's entirely effortless. Also helps you have to fight as elite pirates before you can even get to him, so you're probably not completely full on the tank when you face him. It was a pretty satisfying fight though, even though in my opinion Ridley has become a little oversaturated lately. As for Mother Brain herself, she's perhaps living proof that you can take a boss that was very difficult in an older game, but tighter controls will make it feel substantially easier. The first phase for the boss is basically the same as the original Metroid, but now you have much tighter controls, so she becomes much easier as a result. All you gotta do is dodge or get around the projectiles somehow as you break apart her glass tank. The second phase is likewise pretty easy, as she feels more like the non-Golden Chorizo fight. I'm not complaining, of course, it doesn't exactly break the game, just an observation. It's pretty much a spectacle fight, especially in the third phase. You actually get the non-permanent item I mentioned before in the form of the Hyper Beam. Using her own overpowered laser attack against her, you quickly overwhelm her. Metroid Prime would later reuse the same concept against Metroid Prime's second phase and even call it the Hyper Beam, but really it's just the basic concept here. After what Mother Brain just did, turning her into ash is insanely satisfying. Ultimately though, it isn't Super Metroid's bosses that will be the most memorable, at least for me. The game is all about building up atmosphere as you explore its many depths. Entering new areas for the first time never fails to bring a sense of tension with it, as you have no idea what the new creatures could be capable of. The point that you get some new items that turns those previous threats into jokes is always super satisfying. To me, that little cycle in a Metroidvania game is its biggest strength. You enter a new area, you're on edge, and then you find some new item that makes you a lot stronger than before. Filled with confidence as you're not only stronger, but now you have a better sense of things, you blast through the area's enemies with ease, and then you enter the next area with enemies that are suddenly made with your new equipment in mind, and the tension increases all over again. It's also satisfying when you find secrets and either get upgrades to get more health or armor, or even optional items entirely like the Spacer Beam. Ultimately, it boils down to explore everywhere, build up your strength, and unravel the mysteries within. It gives a nice sense of pride and accomplishment, and it does all this without charging you money to open loot boxes. If you want all the rewards this world has to offer, you're gonna have to look around for them and occasionally blast through a tough foe standing between you and it. That's not even getting into the more advanced techniques I never really made use out of in my playthrough. You've got beam combos and even something called a crystal flash that consumes some of your ammo but completely fills up your health. The game nicely accommodates players who want something a little more, like sword techniques in some Zelda games, but doesn't require it either. That, along with the sequence-breaking opportunities, really does make Super Metroid feel like a game that has a little something for everyone, and there are even a ton of mods to either inject challenge or change the game entirely. From just finding the way forward to going the extra step and actually trying to find upgrades in the rare optional items, Super Metroid heavily encouraged you to sniff out every nook and cranny. It actually trusts you to remember things that you saw before that become passable once you get that critical upgrade, and balances having a map to make things easier without holding your hand too much. It can even get fairly challenging at times depending on how well upgraded you are. There's little doubt that Super Metroid had a big part in shaping Metroidvania to what we know it to be today, and games like Symphony of the Night owe their existence to it. Excellent gameplay all around. Due to the nature of the game, plot isn't really something that's on the forefront. For the most part, it's about exploring the planet and dealing with the hostilities within. That being said, there's still plenty of story in the game, both in the beginning and end parts of the game, and a little throughout the game itself. In the first for the series, Samus actually has dialogue. That's right, Other M was far off from having actually started that trend. The beginning has Samus recounting previous events, essentially. She briefly explains how she defeated Mother Brain for the first time in the NES Metroid, and how she came upon an infant Metroid in Metroid 2 that viewed her as its mother. The rest of it is explaining that she handed over the infant Metroid to a scientist colony, believing that they could harness the Metroid for the betterment of mankind. You can tell this is an older Metroid game, a newer one, especially one like Other M and Fusion, would not portray them so altruistically. In any event, Samus leaves and almost immediately distress signal sounds. I guess they couldn't even go 2 minutes without messing something up, so Samus speeds back, but it's already too late. She arrives to find the scientists all dead and the Metroid's container in the hands of her arch-nemesis, Ridley. Regardless of how well Samus actually fights, Ridley flees and the station is set to self-destruct, forcing Samus to retreat as well. Making her way to planet Zebes, Samus must locate Ridley and the stolen infant Metroid. From here, the game's plot is mostly told through in-game sequences. I rather like such ways of doing things since you're still in control and it's like things are happening dynamically around you. For instance, Samus makes her way to the old part of Zebes from the original Metroid to retrieve the Morph Balls and missiles. Interestingly, the Morph Ball is even in the same place it was in the original. Samus also had to go through Mother Brain's old chamber to get there, which is obviously decayed over time. However, Samus is far from alone. Getting the morph ball caused an alarm to sound and seems to get the space pirates investigating because Mother Brain's lair and the tube to get out are suddenly crawling with them. If I'm not mistaken, this is also the first time we see the space pirates proper, apart from just the big bosses. For a while, of course, the story takes a back seat to exploration and just finding your way. You could create stories for characters like Kraid, Crocomire, and other bosses, but it's mostly inconsequential. It isn't really until the underwater area of Meridia that the plot starts showing again. You see, after Ridley took off with the infant, the pirates had begun making cloning attempts, and it's in Meridia that you see early efforts to clone it. These are what's called Metroids that are single-celled Metroid that can't grip onto you. They can siphon energy, of course, but their weak bodies and inability to grasp prey makes them not much at all of a threat. It's finally at Norfair that Samus confronts and obliterates Ridley. However, the next room over shows that the container is broken open because they already relocated the stolen infant. Eventually making her way into the new Torian, Samus has to face much more successful Metroid clones. The plot really begins to creep into the environment as there are husks of enemies that crumble into dust before a massive Metroid begins clamping down on Samus. With no way to thwart it off, it looks like Samus is as good as dead when at a single point of energy remaining, the Metroid suddenly stops. It gives a low shriek and flies off. It's actually the infant, but it's grown much larger. It didn't even seem to recognize Samus until the absolute last second, possibly because of the length of time they've been separated, and seems to be very guilty about it. As Samus finally confronts Mother Brain reveals she actually had a cybernetic body this time. As the fight drags on, Mother Brain has a devastating charged laser attack that completely overwhelms Samus and leaving her stunned, incapable of fighting back or defending herself. As Mother Brain charges up a killing blow, the infant Metroid bravely appears out of nowhere and starts draining Mother Brain until she's seemingly a husk. It would then begin reversing its siphoning to restore Samus' energy. However, Mother Brain wasn't as dried up as she seemed to be as she revives and starts pelting the infant. Just as the infant finishes restoring Samus' energy and lets go of her, it moves away and back towards Mother Brain, seemingly to attack, only to be shot down. While the 16-bit engine can't properly portray emotion, you can easily imagine the horror and rage burning through Samus in that very moment. It's revealed that not only did the Metroid drain Mother Brain's energy, but it seemed to also drain her ultimate laser attack and passed it on to Samus. In a fit of blind fury, Samus utilizes her own version of the attack called the Hyper Beam. Mother Brain is completely overwhelmed and powerless against the attack, her body becoming redder with heat until she's completely reduced to dust. In a fit of fury, the infant had been avenged. Of course, Zebes is set to self-destruct as Samus has to get out of dodge. One interesting little plot string is that you can choose to go out of your way to save some trapped animals. In optional areas of the game earlier on that can actually teach you things like shine sparking and wall jumping, canon says you do actually save them since they appear in Metroid Fusion and have a prominent role in it. Either way, the mission is complete. While Super Metroid's plot obviously isn't in the forefront beyond the initial setup, it's clear that it isn't completely neglected either. There are moments where there's genuine escalation and it shows the space pirates occupy different areas as the game goes on in addition to their cloning efforts. Somehow it was long enough that the original Metroid swelled to massive size and a lot of Metroids failed and successful were produced from it. Most of the game is about pure exploration, seeing what you can uncover, both good and bad, but the plot elements woven into it were more than enough to carry it. Metroid for the longest time has been known for largely isolated atmosphere as you traverse the world. While the first two certainly had the feelings of isolation down pat, the increased graphics hardware of the Super Nintendo arguably gave Super Metroid the true feeling of atmosphere the previous games couldn't quite nail. No more black backgrounds, you can now see detailed backdrops that added depth to the world. The first thing you see starting the game is an unsettling title screen brimming with mystery. There's a larval Metroid in a tank in a lab with dead scientists around it. While you come to later find out they were killed by Ridley, the title screen certainly made you wonder. One nice thing about the introduction with Samus briefly summarizing events is that you briefly see graphical remakes of both the Mother Brains fight in Metroid 1 and the larval Metroids hatching in Metroid 2. While both would be enhanced further in remakes, Zero Mission and especially Samus Returns respectively, it's very nice to see. It especially helps with the larval Metroid hatching because as Samus Returns would later expand upon, it shows Samus snapping to action and then curious about its non-hostility. It also uses some illustrations mainly of Samus handing over the larval Metroid to the research team. Getting into the ship itself is where you can really start appreciating the game's up visuals at the time. All you know is the ship is abandoned with the bodies of the research team in a few places. Then you see the larval Metroid in its container by itself before Ridley seems to uncloak itself Predator style. After the fight and escaping, the surface of Zebes is very clouded and rainy. I would imagine after being used to the black backgrounds of the previous two, it must have really been mind-blowing. Going inside the cavern, you even see little bugs wisely crawl away from you. Of course, Nintendo also decided to show off some fan service, and I don't mean Samus outside of her suit. As mentioned before, you soon find yourself in the NES Metroid part of Zebes. It's all decayed and certainly feels like you're exploring old ruins. If you played the previous NES game, it's almost like you're returning home, especially finding the morph ball waiting for you in the exact same place. Now I could go on and on with the little touches like the refractions in the background of Meridia and the spores flying around in Brimstar, but I think the footage speaks for itself. One very nice thing is that it retains changes made necessary by Metroid 2. You see, in Metroid 1, most of the actual changes were color palette swaps. Using the missile launcher merely caused her arm cannon to go blue, the Varia suit was mostly a color change, etc. Metroid 2 was on a black and white, or rather black and green palette, so this wasn't possible. Instead, the missile launcher physically opened up the arm cannon, and getting the Varia suit made the suit noticeably beefier. These were retained in Super Metroid in addition to the Varia suit becoming more of an orange color. Naturally, the gravity suit changed to purple in what would become a staple for the franchise for the most part. I'm actually glad this change was made. It better emphasizes the physical differences between things and is far more pleasing to look at. One especially noteworthy thing pertaining to bosses is that it has easily the most gruesome boss moment of the Metroid series. Not the most graphic, mind you, but just the subject matter involved. Essentially, in order to beat Crocomire, you have to get him to back up until he falls into a collapsible floor into magma. I already mentioned this, but what I didn't mention is that you're treated to him screeching in pain as his flesh melts right off his bones. For a creature that didn't appear to have evil intent, simply acting instinctively to defend itself, it's a pretty wretched way to go. Audibly, the game emphasizes mood and atmosphere. The space colony doesn't even have music, just beeps indicating computer activity. When you land on Zebes, it's very moody music illustrating that you're all alone in some unknown world and that there's no guarantee you'll survive. When you get the morph ball back and security detects you with an accompanying alarm, you know there's trouble and it really builds up the tension. While the surface is initially hostile sounding, my favorite moment is actually when you return to the surface later on. As you're going through Brinstar, a gate closes behind you so you're barred from previous areas from that point forward. While that gives it a bit of a claustrophobic feeling, you do eventually make it back to the surface after getting much stronger. When you do, the initial haunting music that played when you first arrived is replaced with a glorious trumpet-boosted piece. This same piece actually plays when Samus gets the Hyper Beam against Mother Brain, and it carries the same feeling that victory is within your grasp, that you've proven too strong for your adversaries to withstand. It's also worth noting that Ridley's theme as we know it now first appeared in Super Metroid, although it also plays for other bosses. It wouldn't become associated with Ridley until Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion, but it's still nice to see here. The sound effects the usual bit of this is fine, although the space jump sounds oddly satisfying with its whirl. I know that probably sounds weird, I just wanted to get it out there. Surprisingly, the game even has a bit of voice acting in the beginning there.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Now, it may not be much, and it's not exactly Oscar-winning or anything, but it's the Super Nintendo with some voice acting, so that's kinda neat. Ultimately, Super Metroid sets out to give you an uneasy feeling of uncharting unexplored territory. This is especially apparent when you first touch down. Everything's completely unknown to you, and you're not sure what lies ahead. As you build up your equipment and make the unknown known, however, your confidence will naturally build, and the music and even sometimes the visuals will change to reflect that. That's what I love about Metroidvania, exploring the unknown and becoming stronger to build up your confidence. The visuals and audio beautifully reflects that from top to bottom and really shows off the music and graphical capabilities of the Super Nintendo. No amount of blast processing could have permitted the Genesis to have anything like this. Super Metroid is considered a milestone for the series, the growing the beard moment if you'll pardon the Star Trek reference. I can see why it evolved it beyond the relatively stiff nature of Metroid and Metroid 2 and really brought about things that the Game Boy Advance games and Samus Returns would later use. While not everything is aged entirely gracefully, missing ledge grabbing feels weird. It's still an amazing game even when I was getting crushed by the giant golden bird. It's a beautiful little game that uses atmosphere and the classic Metroidvania formula to give an emboldened feeling, at least in my humble little opinion. Castlevania Symphony of the Night would come to be known as the other half of the equation for Metroidvania to come, but let's pay respect to our elders and pay homage to Super Metroid that laid much of the groundwork for it and all other Metroidvania to come. Having played games like Guacamelee and Axiom Verge, not to mention almost all the Metroid games, I certainly tip my hat to Super Metroid. While I personally prefer the Metroid Prime games, there's no denying Super Metroid's place in gaming history, and Prime owes itself to Super Metroid. If you like Metroid, Metroidvania, or just video games in general, you owe it to yourself to play this. This has been my review of Super Metroid. Thank you for tuning in with me.